The sleeping passenger. What would you do if someone boarded your bus and never left? For Ben, a routine shift turned into a nightmare that changed his life forever. Ben had been a bus driver for 10 years. He knew the city's late-night routes like the back of his hand. Quiet streets, a handful of sleepy passengers, and the occasional odd character. But one night a man boarded his bus and took a seat at the back. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. And when Ben reached the final stop, the man didn't leave. What followed was a series of events that defied explanation and left Ben questioning his sanity. It was just past midnight, and the streets were quiet as Ben maneuvered the city bus through its usual route. The late shift wasn't glamorous, but he liked the solitude. Most of the passengers were harmless. A few workers heading home, night owls coming from bars, or the occasional student buried in a book. At stop 23, Ben slowed the bus, expecting to pick up a familiar face. Instead, a man stepped out of the shadows. He was tall and thin, his face pale and partially obscured by a dark hoodie. Something about the man's movements caught Ben's attention. They were slow, deliberate, almost too controlled. The man stepped onto the bus without a word. Ben waited for him to pay the fare, but he didn't. Instead, he walked to the very back and sat down. Ben glanced in the rearview mirror. The man's head was tilted down, his face hidden. "Hey, buddy, you need to pay first and first, my friends," Ben called out. The man didn't respond. Ben sighed, deciding it wasn't worth the hassle. He'd seen plenty of weird passengers over the years, and most of them weren't trouble. Putting the bus back in gear, he continued on his route. But as he drove, something began to feel off. Ben kept glancing in the mirror, expecting the man to shift or fidget. But he didn't. He just sat there, perfectly still, his head tilted downward. The other passengers didn't seem to notice, too engrossed in their own worlds. At stop 27, a young woman got on, giving Ben a polite smile as she dropped her coins into the fare box. She took a seat near the middle of the bus, headphones in, scrolling on her phone. Ben felt a strange sense of relief. At least someone normal was on board. The route continued, the city's lights casting fleeting shadows across the interior of the bus. At stop 30, the last two passengers, before the young woman, exited. Now, it was just Ben, the woman, and the man at the back. The silence inside the bus grew heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine. Ben's eyes kept darting to the mirror, where the man remained motionless. "Hey," Ben called out, trying to sound casual. "You okay back there?" The man didn't move. The man probably waited for the right time. The situation was probably too much. The young woman looked up, glancing toward the back. "Is he asleep or something?" she asked, pulling out one of her earbuds. "Maybe," Ben muttered, though he didn't believe it. Something about the man's presence made the air feel colder, heavier. The next stop approached, and Ben slowed the bus. The young woman stood, gathering her bag. She gave Ben a quick nod as she stepped off, the door hissing shut behind her. Immediately, the door swung open, slowing down enough for Ben to pull himself out. Ben glanced in the mirror again. It was just him and the man now. "Last stop coming up," Ben said loudly, his voice echoing through the empty bus. No response. Ben drove the remaining stretch to the terminal, his unease growing with each passing second. When he reached the final stop, He parked the bus and turned to address the man directly. "End of the line, buddy, time to get off." The man didn't move. Ben stood, his fingers gripping the edge of the driver's seat. "Hey!" he barked, louder this time. Still nothing. Gritting his teeth, Ben walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. When he reached the back, he stopped. The man's hoodie obscured most of his face, but what Ben could see made his stomach churn. The man's skin was pale, almost gray, and his lips were cracked and dry. His hands rested limply in his lap, unnaturally still. Ben reached out hesitantly. "Sir, you need to—" Before he could finish, the man's head snapped up. Ben stumbled back, his heart racing. The man's eyes were wrong, completely black, like polished obsidian. His mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "Driver," the man said, his voice low and guttural. "You can't leave yet." Ben's pulse thundered in his ears. What are you talking about? This is the last stop." The man leaned forward slightly, his grin widening. "Not for me." Ben turned and bolted for the front of the bus. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his hands trembling. The man didn't follow. He remained seated at the back, watching. His head tilted at an unnatural angle. Ben grabbed his phone, frantically dialing his supervisor. The call went through, but all he could hear was static. He tried again. Same result. The bus lights flickered, casting erratic shadows along the walls. Ben's breathing grew ragged as he glanced back at the man. He was gone. Ben froze, his eyes darting around the bus. The seats were empty, the aisle clear. "Where are you?" he shouted, his voice cracking. A low chuckle echoed through the bus, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Ben spun around, his eyes wide. The lights flickered again, plunging the bus into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the man was standing at the front of the bus, inches from Ben's face. "You shouldn't have stopped," the man whispered, his breath icy against Ben's skin. Ben screamed, throwing himself backward. The man's grin widened impossibly, his eyes glinting with malice. The bus shook violently, the lights flickering erratically. Ben clung to the driver's seat, his mind racing. "What do you want from me?" he cried. The man's voice filled the air, layered and distorted. "To take you where you need to go." The bus lurched forward, its engine roaring to life. Ben hadn't touched the controls, but the vehicle began moving, accelerating down the empty street. "Stop!" Ben shouted, grabbing the wheel, but it wouldn't budge. The man laughed, his voice echoing like a sinister chorus. "We're almost there." The city outside the windows blurred, the familiar streets warping into something unrecognizable, the buildings twisted, their angles impossible, their shadows writhing like living things. Ben's knuckles turned white as he gripped the dashboard, his heart pounding. Where are you taking me? The man didn't answer. He simply pointed ahead, where a tunnel loomed in the distance. Its entrance was a gaping void, swallowing the dim light of the street lamps. As the bus hurtled toward the tunnel, the man's form began to change, his limbs stretched, his features distorting into something monstrous. His laughter grew louder, drowning out Ben's screams. The bus plunged into the tunnel and everything went black. When Ben awoke, he was sitting in the driver's seat. The bus was parked at the terminal, the sun rising over the city. He blinked, his head pounding. The bus was empty save for his cleaning supplies neatly arranged at the back. But as he stood, he noticed something carved into the dashboard. A single word, scratched deeply into the metal. Thanks. Ben quit his job that day. He never drove a bus again. But sometimes, late at night, he dreams of the tunnel. And in those dreams, he hears the man's voice, whispering softly, "You can't leave yet." Would you keep driving? Subscribe for more stories that'll keep you awake at night. Story number 2, The Frozen Train Station. What would you do if time froze around you, but something kept moving toward you? This isn't science fiction. This happened to Jenna. Jenna was just trying to get home after a long evening with friends. She wasn't a fan of public transport, but tonight the late train was her only option. It was a quiet, cold night, ordinary by all appearances, until things stopped making sense. Time froze, and everything around her became eerily still. Everything, except for one shadowy figure moving steadily toward her. What she experienced that night would leave her questioning reality forever. It was nearing midnight, and Jenna waited alone on the platform of an old train station on the outskirts of the city. The station had seen better days: peeling paint on the walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of mildew in the air. It was the kind of place that gave off a faint feeling of neglect, but Jenna didn't mind. All she wanted was to get home. The train was running late as usual. A few other passengers were scattered across the platform, a man in a business suit, scrolling through his phone, an older woman with a dog-eared book, and a young couple sitting close together, their quiet whispers barely audible over the hum of the station's lights. Jenna sat on a cold metal bench, glancing at her phone. 15 minutes until the train, the app said. She sighed, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. The night felt colder than it should have, with a biting chill that seemed to seep through her clothes. Jenna. Her eyes wandered to the other passengers. They were ordinary enough, people she wouldn't have given a second thought to on any other day. But something about the stillness of the station, combined with the distant rumble of trains that never seemed to arrive, began to make her uneasy. And then the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, just a brief dimming of the fluorescent bulbs overhead, but it happened again, this time for a few seconds longer. The hum of the lights faltered, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Jenna looked up, her brows furrowing. That's when she noticed it. The platform was silent. Completely silent. No murmurs from the couple. No sound of pages turning from the old woman's book. Even the man's phone was eerily still. Jenna stood up, her heart beginning to race. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing faintly. No one answered. She stepped closer to the man in the suit. His face was frozen, his eyes locked on his phone, fingers mid-sprint. The couple hadn't moved either, the woman's head tilted back in silent laughter, the man's hand still reaching for hers. Even the old woman's book was suspended mid-air, a page caught in the act of turning. It was as if the world had stopped. Jenna's breath came faster now, her chest tightening with a growing sense of dread. She spun around, scanning the platform for any sign of movement, any explanation for what was happening. But everything and everyone remained frozen, like mannequins in a display. She pulled out her phone, hoping to find some clue or connection to the outside world, but the screen was blank. No signal, no notifications, not even the time. Just a black void where the display should have been. "Okay, this isn't funny," she muttered, her voice trembling. Her instincts told her to leave, to get as far away from the station as possible. But the exits loomed in the distance, their gates locked and unmoving. She was trapped. In her instincts told her to leave, to get as far away from the station as possible, but the exits loomed in the distance, their gates locked and unmoving. She was trapped. And then she heard it. A faint sound, so quiet she almost missed it. A rhythmic thump, like footsteps on the tracks. She froze, her ears straining to catch the noise. It was coming from the far end of the platform, where the tracks disappeared into darkness. Squinting, she could just make out a shape. A shadow moving slowly along the rails. "Hello?" she called again, her voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. It kept moving, its steps deliberate and unhurried. Jenna backed away from the edge of the platform, her heart pounding. The figure was getting closer now, stepping into the dim light of the station. It was tall, its outline human, but wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its movements too fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. "Stop," Jenna said, her voice barely a whisper. "Please." The figure didn't stop. By now the figure was close enough for Jenna to make out its features, or lack thereof. Its face was shrouded in shadows, as though the light refused to touch it. Where eyes should have been, there were only hollow voids. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying her. Jenna's legs trembled. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bench she'd been sitting on moments ago. The air grew colder, each breath visible in front of her. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty station. The figure paused, its head tilting to the other side. For a brief moment, Jenna thought it might actually listen. But then it took another step forward, raising one long, shadowy arm to point directly at her. Jenna turned and ran. She sprinted toward the station exit, her footsteps pounding against the concrete floor. The gates loomed ahead, but they didn't budge. She tugged at them desperately, her fingers aching from the effort. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, closer now. "Are you doing this?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. The figure's voice answered, low and guttural, reverberating through the stillness. "You don't belong here." Jenna froze, her breath hitching. She turned slowly, her back pressed against the gate. The figure stood mere feet away, its form shifting and distorting like smoke. "I don't understand," she whispered. The figure raised both arms now, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the platform. The lights flickered violently, plunging the station into darkness, before surging back to life. In that brief moment, the figure lunged. Jenna screamed, throwing her hands up to shield herself, but instead of a crushing blow, there was nothing. The air was warm again. The hum of the station lights returned, steady and unbroken. She opened her eyes. The figure was gone. Around her, the world had resumed. The man in the suit scrolled through his phone. The older woman turned her page, and the couple laughed softly, oblivious to Jenna's panic. Jenna staggered to the bench, her legs trembling beneath her. She scanned the platform, searching for any sign of the shadowy figure, but it was as if it had never been there. When the train finally arrived, she boarded without hesitation. She sat near the door, clutching her bag tightly, her eyes darting to every shadow and dark corner. For the rest of the ride home, her mind raced. What had she seen? Was it real? And if it wasn't, then why did the chill linger on her skin? To this day, Jenna avoids that station. She doesn't take the train late at night, and she never talks about what happened. But deep down, she knows the figure is still out there, waiting for the next person to cross its path. Think you'd survive that? Subscribe for more stories that'll keep you awake at night. The elevator that never stops. What if an elevator stopped at a floor that doesn't exist? For Mark, this wasn't just a glitch, it was a nightmare. Mark was a building maintenance worker with years of experience. Fixing leaks, inspecting wiring, and handling complaints, it was all in a day's work. Night shifts, though, were another story. Quiet, lonely, and often eerie. But one night, while inspecting a faulty elevator, Mark encountered something that couldn't be explained. The elevator took him to a floor that didn't exist on the building's blueprints. What he discovered there would change his life forever. Mark's shift started at 10 p.m., just like any other night. The building, a corporate office downtown, was mostly empty after hours. He enjoyed the quiet, even if the silence sometimes felt oppressive. That night, his checklist included a complaint about one of the elevators. Tenants had reported it acting strangely, stopping at random floors, lights flickering, and doors refusing to close. Mark wasn't surprised. This building was old, and maintenance issues were common. Armed with his tools and a flashlight, Mark made his way to the elevator bank. He pressed the call button, and the offending elevator arrived with a cheerful ding. The doors slid open, revealing an empty cab. He stepped inside, the faint scent of cleaning products lingering in the air. The panel was functional, but a small red indicator light blinked above the emergency stop button. Probably just a wiring issue, Mark muttered. He pressed the button for the top floor to test the system. The elevator hummed to life, and for a moment, everything seemed fine. But then, it stopped abruptly between the 10th and 11th floors. Mark frowned, pressing the buttons again. The lights flickered, and the cab shuddered slightly before resuming its ascent. When it finally stopped, the display above the doors read 13. Mark froze. There was no 13th floor in this building. Mark's heart pounded as the doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. He peered into the hallway beyond, but what he saw didn't make sense. The corridor was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights that cast long, distorted shadows. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled damp, like a basement after a flood. Must be some kind of service level, Mark said to himself, though he didn't believe it. He knew the building inside and out. There was no record of this floor on any blueprint he'd ever seen. Cautiously, he stepped out of the elevator, propping the doors open with his toolbox. The floor beneath his boots creaked, and the sound echoed unnaturally, as though the space was much larger than it appeared. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. At intervals, doors lined the walls, each one slightly ajar. Mark's flashlight beam swept across the nearest door, revealing a room filled with old furniture, broken chairs, and dusty filing cabinets. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered. As he moved further down the hallway, he noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols scratched into the plaster, looping and jagged, like they'd been carved in a frenzy. His unease deepened with every step. Then he heard it. A faint sound, like whispering, coming from somewhere deeper in the hallway. It wasn't clear, just murmurs that seemed to dance at the edge of his hearing. He stopped, straining to catch the words, but they were just out of reach. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The whispering stopped. Mark's flashlight flickered, and for a moment he was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, the hallway had changed. The doors were all closed now, and the walls seemed closer, the symbols more vivid and dripping with something dark. A loud clang echoed from behind him, and Mark spun around, his flashlight beam darting frantically. The elevator doors had closed, sealing him in. Panic surged through him as he ran back to the elevator, slamming his fists against the call button. Come on," he yelled. The elevator didn't respond. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow darted across the far end of the hallway. Mark turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Who's there?" he demanded. The shadow appeared again, closer this time. It moved unnaturally, its shape shifting and elongating as it crept along the walls. The whispering returned, louder now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from all directions. Mark backed away, his breathing ragged. He stumbled into one of the rooms, slamming the door shut behind him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were nearly deafening. He turned to survey the room, desperate for an escape. It was filled with old machinery, rusted gears, wires, and levers that seemed part of some ancient contraption.
In the center of the room stood a large mirror, its surface cracked and cloudy. As Mark approached the mirror, he saw his reflection, or at least, he thought it was his reflection. The figure in the glass moved independently, tilting its head in a way that Mark hadn't. His reflection grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. The whispers stopped. Mark stumbled backward, his mind racing. The reflection raised its hand and pointed to something behind him. Slowly, Mark turned. Standing in the doorway was a figure, shrouded in shadows. Its outline was barely human, its limbs too long, its head too large. It stepped into the room, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "No," Mark whispered, his voice shaking. "This isn't real." The figure lunged, and Mark screamed, raising his arms to shield himself. But instead of an impact, there was a sudden rush of air and a deafening silence. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the elevator. The display above the doors read 1, and the familiar lobby greeted him as the doors slid open. Mark staggered out, gasping for breath. The security guard at the front desk looked up, concerned. "You okay, man?" the guard asked. Mark didn't answer. He glanced back at the elevator, its doors now closed. The red indicator light was gone, as if nothing had ever been wrong. He left the building that night and never returned. But sometimes late at night he dreams of the 13th floor, and in those dreams, the whispers are still waiting for him. Would you take that ride? Subscribe for more stories that push the boundaries of reality.
Story number 4. The Mirror at the Gym. What if your reflection wasn't yours? For Mike, the gym's mirrors weren't just reflecting reality. They were hiding something far worse. Mike loved working the late shift at his local gym. It was peaceful. Just him, a few regulars, and the hum of the equipment. But one night, as he cleaned the empty gym, the mirrors began to act differently. At first, it was small things, shadows that didn't belong, movements that didn't match his own. But as the night wore on, the truth of what lurked beyond the glass would leave him questioning reality and fighting for his life. Mike's shift started like any other. He clocked in at 9 p.m., grabbed his cleaning supplies, and made his rounds. The gym was nearly empty, save for a couple of late-night regulars finishing their routines. By 11 p.m., the gym was quiet. The last customer waved goodbye, and Mike locked the front doors behind him. He always enjoyed this part of the night, the stillness, the time to himself. The gym's mirrors stretched along almost every wall, giving the space an open, expansive feel. But tonight, something about them felt off. As Mike mopped the floors near the free weights, he caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind him, but there was no one there. He looked into the mirror. At first glance, everything seemed normal. His reflection stared back, his mop in hand, the empty gym stretching behind him. But something didn't feel right. Mike moved the mop to the left. His reflection did the same. He moved it to the right. The reflection followed. Then, as he stood still, the reflection blinked, just a fraction of a second before he did. Mike's stomach tightened. "Weird lighting," he muttered, trying to convince himself it was nothing. He continued mopping, but the unease didn't go away. Every time he glanced at the mirrors, he felt like something was watching. Finishing the floor, he moved to the cardio area. The machines hummed softly as they powered down for the night. He leaned against the treadmill, wiping it down with a cloth, and glanced at the mirror wall across from him. This time, he froze. A dark shadow moved across the reflection, passing behind the row of treadmills. But when Mike spun around, the gym behind him was empty. Oh, Okay, no, he said out loud, trying to laugh. This isn't happening. The gym was locked. The security cameras at the front desk showed nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of being watched pressed down on him like a weight. He decided to test it. Standing directly in front of the mirror, he waved his hand. His reflection mirrored him perfectly. Then he turned his head slightly, pretending to glance to the side, but kept his eyes locked on the reflection. For a split second, his reflection didn't move. Mike stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the mirror, his mind racing. Maybe he was tired. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But then it happened again. As he stood frozen, his reflection stepped forward. Mike's heart pounded as he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a bench. The reflection in the mirror didn't just step forward. It smiled. Not a normal, friendly smile, but a smart, outright raging, unhappy smart. Mike muttered, grabbing his phone from his pocket. The screen was dark, like dead. The gym's lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. Mike turned, desperate to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection was gone. The glass stared back at him, empty. A chill ran down his spine. He backed away slowly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure nothing was behind him. But then he heard it. A faint tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. His eyes snapped back to the mirror. His reflection was there again, but it wasn't him. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, its grin widening. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass from the inside. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice low and distorted. Mike shook his head, backing further away. "No, this isn't real." The tapping grew louder, more insistent. The figure's hand pressed harder against the glass, the surface rippling like water. "Let me out," it repeated, louder this time. Then the glass cracked. Mike turned and bolted, his footsteps echoing through the empty gym. He made it to the front desk, fumbling for the keys to unlock the doors. But as he slid the key into the lock, the lights went out. The gym was plunged into darkness, save for a faint glow from the mirror wall behind him. He didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his eyes on the door, to get out. But he couldn't help himself. Slowly, he turned. The mirrors glowed, faintly, the cracks spreading like veins. From each fracture, black liquid oozed, dripping on to the floor, and then they stepped through. Not one, but many. Dozens of shadowy figures poured out of the mirrors, their forms twisting and shifting like smoke. They surrounded Mike, their hollow eyes staring, their grins impossibly wide. "You shouldn't have stayed," one of them whispered. Mike screamed, his voice swallowed by the darkness. Epilogue. The next morning, the gym's manager arrived to find the front doors locked and the lights off. Inside, everything was as it should be, except for the mirrors. Each one was cracked, the fractures forming strange looping patterns, and in the center of the floor was a single mop, lying in a puddle of black liquid. No one ever saw Mike again. Would you dare look in the mirror? Subscribe for more stories that'll leave you questioning what's real. Story number 5. The house call. What if the person asking for help wasn't the one in danger? For paramedic Sarah, a late-night call to an empty house became her worst nightmare. Sarah was used to working late. Being a paramedic meant answering emergency calls at all hours, often to situations that were anything but ordinary. But one night, a call to a remote house led her into something she couldn't explain. The cries for help on the phone were desperate, frantic. But when Sarah arrived, the house was empty. What happened next would haunt her forever. It was just after midnight when Sarah's radio crackled to life. A dispatcher's voice came through. Unit 17, we have a possible medical emergency at 432 Willow Creek Road. Caller reports severe injury, requesting immediate assistance. Sarah glanced at her partner Tom, who was finishing a coffee at the station. "That's out in the middle of nowhere," she said, frowning. Tom shrugged. We've had stranger calls. Let's check it out." They hopped into the ambulance, and Sarah punched the address into the GPS. Willow Creek Road was a long, winding stretch on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods, the kind of place where street lights were a luxury and cell service was hit or miss. As they drove, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the call. The dispatcher had said the caller sounded panicked, like they were in immediate danger, but there had been no details about the injury, no description of what they were walking into. The closer they got to the address, the darker the road became. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches forming eerie shapes in the ambulance's headlights. When they reached the location, Sarah's unease deepened. The house was old and isolated, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. There were no lights on, no signs of life. "This is it?" Tom asked, pulling the ambulance to a stop. "Looks like it," Sarah replied, though her gut told her something was wrong. Sarah grabbed her medical bag, and the two approached the house. The porch creaked under their weight, and the air smelled damp, like rotting wood. Sarah knocked on the door, her heart pounding. "Hello? This is EMS. We're here to help." No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Tom shone his flashlight through the window, but the glass was too dirty to see much inside. Maybe they passed out, he suggested. Sarah tried the doorknob. It turned easily, and the door creaked open. "Hello?" she called again, stepping inside. The interior was dark, the air heavy with an unpleasant odor, like mildew and something metallic. The floorboards groaned beneath their boots as they moved cautiously through the entryway. "Dispatch said they heard screaming, right?" Sarah whispered. Tom nodded. "Yeah, but it doesn't look like anyone's here." They split up, Sarah heading toward what looked like the living room, while Tom checked the kitchen. The living room was sparse, with old furniture covered in sheets. A large fireplace dominated one wall, its blackened bricks adding to the sense of abandonment. Ah! That's when Sarah heard it. A faint noise, coming from upstairs. It was soft, almost imperceptible, a muffled cry, like someone trying to call for help but unable to. Tom," she hissed. He appeared in the doorway, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "What?" "Upstairs. I think someone's up there." They exchanged a glance, then headed for the staircase. The stairs creaked loudly with every step, the sound echoing through the empty house. The noise grew louder as they ascended. Definitely a voice now, though the words were still indistinguishable. They reached the top of the stairs, where a long hallway stretched before them. Doors lined both sides, all slightly ajar. "Which room?" Tom asked, his voice low. Sarah pointed to the far end of the hall, where the faint cries seemed to be coming from. As they approached, the cries suddenly stopped. The door to the last room was closed. Sarah reached for the knob, her hand trembling. "Ready?" she asked Tom. He nodded, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. Sarah turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. It was small, with peeling wallpaper and a single chair in the center. On the floor was an old cassette recorder, its tape spinning slowly. Sarah picked up the recorder, her pulse racing. The cries were coming from it. Someone had recorded them and left the tape playing. "Who does this?" she whispered. Tom's flashlight beam swept across the room, stopping on the far wall. There, scratched into the plaster, were words. Sarah's blood ran cold. A loud bang echoed from downstairs, and they both jumped. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Tom didn't answer. He was already moving toward the hallway, his flashlight bouncing wildly. "Tom, wait," Sarah called, following him. As they reached the staircase, they froze. The front door, which had been wide open, was now shut. Someone or something was standing at the bottom of the stairs. It was a figure, barely visible in the dim light, tall, with unnaturally long limbs and a head that tilted unnervingly to one side. "Who's there?" Tom shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed directly at them. The flashlight in Tom's hand flickered, then went out completely. Panic surged through Sarah as darkness enveloped them. She grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him back toward the upstairs hallway. We need to get out of here," she hissed. "Well, the stairs are blocked." They stumbled into one of the rooms, slamming the door behind them. Sarah's hands fumbled for her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17. We're trapped at 432 Willow Creek. We need backup now." The radio crackled, but no voice came through, just static. The faint sound of footsteps echoed outside the door, slow and deliberate. "Tom," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you still have the recorder?" Tom pressed the play button, and the room filled with the sound of the recorded cries. The footsteps outside the door stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, shaking the walls. The door splintered as something heavy slammed against it. Sarah and Tom scrambled backward, their eyes locked on the door as it buckled under the force. "This is it," Tom whispered. But just as the door was about to give way, the sound of sirens pierced the night. The growling stopped. The door creaked open slowly, but the hallway beyond was empty. They didn't wait to investigate. Grabbing their things, they bolted down the stairs and out the front door, running straight for the flashing lights of the arriving police cars. Epilogue. The police searched the house but found no sign of anyone else. The tape recorder was confiscated, but the cries on it were gone. The tape was blank. Sarah and Tom never went back to Willow Creek Road. They couldn't explain what they'd seen, and no one believed them. But Sarah knows what she heard that night. The cries weren't just a recording. And whatever was in that house, it wasn't human. Would you answer the call? Subscribe for more stories that'll make you think twice about helping strangers. Story number 6. The Unmarked Room. What if you found a room in your building that wasn't supposed to exist? For James, opening that door was the worst mistake of his life. James worked the night shift as a janitor in a sprawling corporate office building. It was a quiet job, mostly sweeping floors and emptying trash cans. But one night, while cleaning the basement level, he discovered something he'd never noticed before. A door with no markings, no handle, and no reason to exist. What he found behind that door would turn his routine shift into a nightmare he'd never escape. The night began like any other. James arrived at the building at 10 p.m., his cleaning cart rattling as he rolled it across the marble lobby floor. The building was massive, 50 stories tall, housing offices for dozens of companies. But at night it was deserted, the lights dimmed, and the halls eerily quiet. James didn't mind the solitude. It gave him time to think, even if the building sometimes gave him the creeps. The dim, flickering lights in the stairwells, the random hum of machinery in the walls, the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far. It was all part of the job. On this particular night, James's schedule included the basement level, a sprawling space filled with storage rooms, maintenance equipment, and old office furniture. It was his least favorite area. Cold, damp, and always smelling faintly of mold. He wheeled his cart into the elevator, humming to himself as the doors closed. The ride down was slow, the elevator creaking as it descended. When it finally reached the basement, the doors slid open with a ding, revealing the familiar concrete hallway. James set to work, mopping the floors and dusting the shelves. But as he rounded a corner near the far end of the basement, he noticed something odd. There was a door he'd never seen before. The door was unmarked, no signs, no labels, not even a handle. Just a plain gray slab of metal set into the wall. James frowned, his brow furrowing. He'd worked in this building for over a year. He knew every nook and cranny. So, how had he never noticed this door before? Curiosity gnawed at him. He approached the door, running his fingers along its cool, smooth surface. There was no keyhole, no keypad, no obvious way to open it. But as he leaned closer, he noticed something strange. A faint humming sound, like a low electrical buzz, coming from behind the door. Suppose is just me? Probably just a maintenance room, he muttered, trying to convince himself. But the hair on the back of his neck prickled. Something about the door didn't feel right. He stepped back, staring at it for a long moment. Then, as if in response to his thoughts, the humming grew louder. The sound seemed to vibrate in his chest, making his heart race. James shook his head. "Get a grip," he said aloud. He turned to leave, but as he did, a soft click echoed behind him. He froze, glancing over his shoulder. The door had opened. James's stomach churned as he approached the now ajar door. A sliver of darkness spilled out into the hallway, the faint owl hum now a steady drone. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open wider. Inside, the room was pitch black. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal nothing. The room was empty, its walls bare and unadorned. But the hum was louder now, almost deafening. And then he saw them. Markings, etched into the concrete walls, glowing faintly. They were symbols, looping, jagged, and utterly unfamiliar. James stepped closer, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The markings seemed to pulse, their glow intensifying as he approached. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. The hum shifted, becoming rhythmic. James spun around, his heart pounding. He grabbed the door handle, yanking with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the metal. "Hey, is anyone out there?" he shouted. His voice echoed, swallowed by the oppressive hum. The room grew colder, the air heavy and thick. James's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The glowing symbols pulsed faster now, their light illuminating the room in brief, jagged bursts. Then the breathing stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. It pressed down on James, suffocating him. He turned slowly, his flashlight beam darting across the empty space. But the room wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood in the corner, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles, its head tilted as it stared at him, its eyes glowing faintly with the symbols on the walls. James stumbled backward, his breath hitching. Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. It stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. James's back hit the wall. His flashlight flickered again, then went out completely. He was plunged into darkness. The hum returned, louder now, vibrating through his bones. "Please," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let me out." The figure stopped inches from him. He could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, its glowing eyes burning into his soul. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Its voice was deep, guttural, and layered, as though a dozen voices were speaking at once. James squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to come from inside his own head. He felt the figure's icy breath on his face, its presence overwhelming. And then, silence. When James opened his eyes, he was back in the hallway. The door was gone. He stumbled forward, his knees weak, his breathing ragged. His cleaning cart was exactly where he'd left it, as though nothing had happened. But something had changed. The hallway seemed darker, the shadows longer. And when he glanced at his hands, he noticed faint, glowing symbols etched into his skin. James quit his job the next day. He couldn't explain what he'd seen, and he didn't want to, but the symbols never left him. Sometimes, late at night, he hears the hum again. It starts soft, barely noticeable, but it grows louder with each passing second. And when he closes his eyes, he sees the figure, waiting in the darkness. He knows it's only a matter of time before the door finds him again. Would you open the door? Subscribe for more stories that'll leave you questioning reality. Have you ever picked someone up only to regret it? This driver did, and it turned into the most terrifying experience of his life. Jake was a seasoned rideshare driver. Night shifts were his thing. Fewer passengers meant quieter rides and fewer hassles. He'd seen all types: partygoers, tired office workers, even the occasional awkward first date. But nothing could have prepared him for the one night his passenger didn't seem normal. This wasn't just a strange encounter, it was something far more sinister. Jake's shift started like any other. He grabbed his coffee, checked his app, and headed toward the busiest part of the city.
Fridays were always eventful, with people leaving bars or heading to late-night parties. For the first couple of hours, the rides were uneventful. Around 11:15 p.m., Jake received a new request. The pickup point was at a small diner just outside the city. Jake didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual for someone to catch a ride from the outskirts. The fare was good, and the destination wasn't too far out. He accepted the ride, hit the navigation, and drove off. When he arrived at the diner, it was nearly empty. The faint glow of a neon "Open" sign flickered in the window, and a single figure stood under the streetlight outside. Jake pulled up to the curb and rolled down his window slightly. "You call for a ride?" he asked. The man didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the car, opened the back door, and slid into the seat behind Jake. The man's movements were deliberate, but oddly stiff, almost robotic. Jake glanced in the rearview mirror. The man wore a long coat, buttoned to the top, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. Jake couldn't see much, but something about the man's silence felt off. "Where are you headed?" Jake asked, trying to keep things casual. The man didn't answer. He just stared out the window, his face hidden beneath the hat's brim. Jake started driving, hoping the passenger would eventually speak up. Silence wasn't unusual. Some people preferred quiet rides. But this was different. Most passengers at least nodded, or gave some sort of acknowledgement. As they drove, Jake couldn't help but feel the air in the car grow colder. At first, he thought it was the night chill, but then he noticed something odd. The vents weren't blowing any air at all. The heater was off, but the cold seemed to seep into the car like a presence of its own. To distract himself, Jake turned on the radio, hoping the music would ease the tension. Static crackled through the speakers, though the station had been clear just moments before. He switched stations, but the static remained. Uneasy, he turned it off entirely. In the rearview mirror, Jake caught a glimpse of his passenger's face. It was pale, unnaturally pale, as though the man hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes, shadowed under the hat, seemed dark and empty. Jake's grip tightened on the wheel. "Everything okay back there?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. The man slowly turned his head toward Jake but didn't speak. Instead, he raised one hand and pointed down the road. Jake glanced at his phone's GPS. The destination was still a few miles away, but the man's gesture made his stomach twist. It wasn't the action itself. It was the way his hand moved, stiff and deliberate, like a puppet being controlled. The road grew darker as they left the city lights behind. Trees lined either side of the street, their branches forming twisted shapes in the moonlight. The eerie silence inside the car felt heavier with each passing mile. He had so much at hope for just to call the investigation in the seat. Enough to make Jake's pulse quicken. He was holding on to so much in the jacket pocket, his heart beating faster than its usual pace. He brushed it off, telling himself he was imagining things. The man was quiet, sure, but maybe he was just tired or drunk. Jake took a deep breath and tried to focus on the road. About 5 minutes from the destination, Jake's phone buzzed with a notification. At first, he ignored it, but then he glanced at the screen and froze. "Passenger has canceled the ride." His blood ran cold. If the ride was canceled, why was the man still in the car? Jake slowed down, pulling over to the side of the road. "Hey," he said, his voice trembling. "The ride's canceled. This is as far as I can take you." The man didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward, his face partially visible under the hat. Jake felt his breath, cold and dry, like the air inside a crypt. "Keep driving," the man whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with something unnatural. Jake's instincts screamed at him to refuse, but fear rooted him in place. He pressed the gas, the car lurching forward as they continued down the road. The GPS showed no destination now, just an empty stretch of highway leading into the woods. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, and his heart nearly stopped. The man's face was fully visible now, and it wasn't human. His skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, and his eyes were empty sockets. The faint, ghostly outline of his mouth formed a chilling smile. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. He turned around, ready to confront the man, but the back seat was empty. Panic surged through him as he looked around, his breaths coming in short gasps. The passenger door was still closed, and there was no sign of anyone outside the car. Shaking, Jake sped back toward the city, his mind racing to make sense of what had happened. When he finally got home, he pulled up the dashcam footage, hoping it would provide answers. The video showed the man getting into the car, but little else. At some point during the ride, the footage glitched. When it resumed, the back seat was empty. But the timestamp showed no stops or interruptions. Jake couldn't shake the experience. He quit driving the next day and never accepted another ride request again. To this day, he wonders who or what was in his car that night. What would you have done in Jake's place? Subscribe for more stories that'll keep you up at night.